Some of us grew up being the helper, the one who held it all together, the responsible one, the strong one, the fixer. But what happens when that child grows up and is still carrying the weight that was never theirs to hold? Today's episode is for every person who grew up parentified. Now, you may not know what that word means, but we have Dr. Uejin Kim here with us today, who's going to explain to us a little bit more. But basically, it's taking on emotional roles that belonged to adults. And maybe now you find yourself exhausted, anxious, disconnected from your own needs. So we're going to dive into the intersection of mental health, emotional wounds, and spiritual restoration with my guest who bridges all three so beautifully.
Are you tired of repeating the same patterns, feeling stuck in your story, and wondering if real change is even possible? In my book, Unstuck, Break Free from What's Holding You Back and Create a Life You Love, I walk you through the path from survival to transformation, blending faith, neuroscience, and soul-deep healing. This book, it's not just words on a page. It's a companion for your journey. Whether you've experienced trauma or just feel lost in the noise of life, Unstuck will meet you there with truth, compassion, and tools that actually work. It's time to stop surviving and start living your story with purpose. Grab your copy today on Amazon.
Welcome to the It's Your Story to Tell podcast. I'm your host, Megan Babcock. And today, this guest is someone whose work deeply inspires me. Dr. Uejin Kim, she's a dual board certified child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist. She integrates evidence-based psychiatric care with spiritual wisdom and lived experience. Having navigated her own childhood wounds within a well-intentioned Korean culture context, she now helps others understand their past, embrace their present, and cultivate compassion for their inner child. And this allows you to finally thrive. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm just honored to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So let's start talking a little bit about what is parentification and how does it shape your emotional and mental health in adulthood?
So the term parentified is a word to describe how the role of a child was parentified in the context of family structure. So traditionally and ideally, adult is supposed to be the one who's providing security and feeling safe and protecting that space and regulating emotions. But a lot of times when you have parents who are emotionally immature or emotionally insecure, that role kind of falls to the kid. So kind of example is, let's say that parents are fighting and it's kind of getting out of control. Oftentimes you hear stories of kids jumping in to stop the fighting and saying, "Hey guys, stop," or "This is not making me feel safe." And kids are the one who has to voice and communicate uncomfortable feelings. So that is actually a role of a more mature adult. But because parents are, you know, I wouldn't say fighting is a sign of insecurity, but because parents are not regulated, kids are kind of stepping in and being parentified in that context.
Thank you for explaining that. This show up, you talked about how it shows up in a child
hmm
stepping in. Maybe could they not be just stepping in into a fight, but maybe they have parents who are very focused on providing for needs physically, but then emotionally unavailable. And so
Right.
the kid is trying to take care of themselves, to not be a burden, to kind of have themselves together because their parents are stressed maybe about finances or putting pressure on the child to be different than they were growing up. Is that
Right.
part of this or is that something different?
Yeah, and there's a fine line between kids being parentified and kids changing their behavior. So when we're disciplining a child or guiding a child, right? So let's say that I have two boys, they're 5 and 7 right now. So they're always butting heads. So then I'm separating them. I'm talking to them and I say, if you punch him, then you're going to get punched back. Do you like that? I'm still holding the authority and control and guidance, and they're making the decision, "Oh, I don't wanna be punched, so maybe I should just ask mom for help." So they're actually finding choices within that parental guidance, right? But let's say the kid reads and then it's like there's no food or parents are always stressed and they're always fighting about money, but they really want Legos. But if somebody's like, "Hey, what do you want for Christmas?" Like, "Oh, nothing, nothing." Like that will be a little bit more kids taking on the role of pacifying, the situation and not adding the burden. So, and I just want to clarify that you might have been parentified without your parents intending for you to be parentified.
Right.
And that is easy because a lot of times the trend is, oh, my parents were narcissists or my parents did this to me. Yes and no. So I do want to kind of protect the intention and effort from our previous generation. But how
Yeah.
this shows up as that child grows up after being parentified is when you're parentified, you're being asked to perform beyond your capacity. So you're asked to perform as an adult when you're a child. So what this does is it breaks the glass ceiling of what you think you're capable of. Like if the mom was beating dad or dad was beating mom and you had to take care of your younger siblings, making sure that they're safe, right?
Mm.
Then you're acting like a parent role for your siblings. Now the capacity of this is my role and this is their role is broken. So how this happens is now you grow up thinking and unsure of what's my job and what's their job. Now everything feels like my job and you had to be excellent and nothing less. So it takes the expectation of self to an extreme. And if you don't meet that, then you have that insecure, what we say is like insecure attachment, kind of insecurity, like, ooh, like if I don't perform and fix their problem, then it's going to bite me back, or it's going to come back at me. You have that sense of insecurity if you don't perform at an excellent level at work or relationships or even hobbies, right?
Mm.
Or you're not fixing everybody else's problem and carrying their burden on your shoulders, then you feel really insecure because you have that sense of responsibility.
I really appreciate that you shared that this isn't about blaming people. This is about gaining understanding.
Mhm.
If you looked in, you would say very loving home. But there was this aspect of a lack of connection on an emotional level. And in order to get the connection or the recognition, it was you have to show up in this certain way. You need to
Mhm.
perform at this certain level. And it resulted in me hiding so much of my struggle, which then went on to cause harm in my life, in my relationship choices, in my parenting. And for so long, I didn't understand where it was coming from because I looked at my home and all of my
Mhm.
opportunity and felt like there's something wrong with me,
Mm.
in this situation. And as I've done my healing work, I've been on this healing journey now for quite a while, almost like 9 years of
Yeah.
really doing the deep work. I'm realizing and being able to have compassion, one for myself, right?
Mhm.
Because when you know more, you can respond differently. And when you know more, you do better, right? Because
Yeah.
before I didn't know. So it wasn't like I was intending
Mhm.
to cause harm, choose bad relationships. It was just that I didn't understand what was going on underneath that was driving those behaviors. And as I've looked and reflected and allowed God to walk me through my story, it's allowed me to also have compassion and look at other people's story, my parents, my
Mhm.
grandparents, and being able to see, my dad just sent a text to us girls. His dad would have been 95 just a couple days ago, and he talked about his story and how
Mm.
it impacted him, but yet there was so much better in his life than it was in his dad's life or his great grandfather who came here from another country. And so we have to take into context there are personality disorders and there are these things, and we all kind of fall on the spectrum. I think of narcissism, I was educating myself on it, and I was reading this book that challenged me. Wait, do you have narcissism? And I was like, well, if I'm saying maybe I have narcissism, I probably don't.
Yeah,
But
that's
but there are tendencies, and those tendencies are self-protection,
Mhm.
right? And so a lot of these personality disorders, and you're the expert, but
Mm.
also come out of wounding, generational trauma that's been passed down. And as we talk about this more, it
Mhm.
gives us this opportunity to gain understanding and to say, I want to break that cycle for my family.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more, because we're talking about generational, but there's also cultural
Mhm.
expectations that get passed down generationally. And how did that show up in your life and impact this way of showing up?
Yeah, so as I'm working out my story, just like you, Megan, I'm learning what specific context gives me the superpower that I have. We're always pursuing this journey to get to know what makes us tick. It was interesting because I recently was a panelist at a Mustard Seed Generation, which is a Korean American mental health conference. So bring it down to my culture, my profession. And I was one of the panelists with other Korean American psychologists and therapists kind of sharing their story. And, in that specific, like getting rid of all the confounding factor, what was kind of impressionable to me was that I'm very unique, even in this group of Korean American therapists, that I was oldest of the three. And I was raised by my grandma who survived Cold War. So she kind of raised me in a Cold War expectation. There was a lot of relationship tension amongst my aunts and uncles, and also from my grandma to my grandparents to my parents. And being oldest of the three and being raised by my grandma, there was a lot of expectation of being a daughter, and especially oldest daughter. I was told, you take care of your brothers. And I was left with my brothers at a young age, maybe 6, 7, 8, sometimes
Oh.
supervising them at home, of course, but because my grandma was Cold War, right? The goal is just live at the end of the day. Sometimes she was very hands off. So now I'm looking back and raising my kids at 5 and 7. And sometimes I have these moments like, oh my God, like I cannot imagine my oldest taking care of the youngest at all for even 2 hours. So those are the moments where I'm like, wow, Eugene, like your life was hard. Now, in the beginning of the healing journey, there was a lot of anger. There was a lot of grief. There was a lot of frustration and wondering why my parents didn't choose to reverse the cycle themselves. Like, why did everything fall on me? And
Mm.
for people who are generational cycle breakers, you will have that anger because you're hyper responsible because of this, but now you have to be hyper responsible to break the cycle yourself. So just letting the audience know, I know how it feels. And I
Mhm.
had to give myself space to be angry because before it was, don't be angry. You have it better than me, or you have it so easy. While it was technically true, I think that emotional reality as a child is not fair. And I had to give myself space for my little Eugene to say, it's not fair. And I had to say, you're right. This is not fair in some context. And after a few years of giving myself space to just express, I think in the end, God redeems and God's truth starts to parent me, not what my parents were saying to me. And then I have this foundation, secure foundation of I know who I am. I know my worth doesn't change. And I know that there's an unconditional safety and love and acceptance, somewhere. And then I was able to extend grace. Once I accepted that grace for me, which is an uncomfortable grace, I'm able to extend that grace to my parents and to my grandparents and just understand that this was their best. It was not
Mm.
ideal, but it was
Sure.
their best.
Before we go over to part two, can you just share a little bit about carrying this emotional responsibility young has an impact later in life? What might that look like if someone's
Mm.
sitting here thinking, was I impacted by that?
Yeah, so kind of going back to the definition of parentified child, right? There's no boundaries or clear expectations and clear margin of this is your job and this is their job. And how it showed up in my life was everything that was going bad, quote unquote bad, was my responsibility to fix, or it was a representation of how I'm doing in life. So, for example, when my kids are not sleeping well, and I read this book that, slept babies are happy babies, and it's gonna sleep begets sleep. And if you have sleep debt, then they're gonna never sleep. So every time they didn't sleep, then I felt like I'm getting like F as a mom, and then I have this fear of if I don't control this, then it's gonna come back at me. Or if my communication in my marriage sucks, right? And we know the saying, it takes two to tango and it's 50-50. But for some reason, if my marriage is not healthy at optimal shape, then it's my fault. I have to do something about it. Or if a relative have substance abuse, and let's say that I'm a psychiatrist, then it's my job to reach out and get him the help, So there was no sense of accountability for others and also respect for
Mm,
others. Like what if they don't choose that route? Or what if my husband choose to not engage, or my kid is just a kid, it's a baby. There's no respect for other elements and other beings. It was, I have to produce an outcome because that represents me. And it becomes kind of performance. Everything is a performance,
mhm,
everything is an outcome, and everything represents me. So, I mean, if you can imagine, if everything that you touch is a representation of you, then it's so tiring to always be excellent in everything and every else's lives that is
mm,
affiliated with you. So I was so bitter and I was so irritable. And then interestingly, what started my healing journey was I was bitter and angry and irritable around my kids and saying the things that my parents said out of irritable sense or irritable mood. And that was a wake up call for me because I was like, I know that it's not fair that I have to be the cycle breaker, and I have to be the hyper responsible one, but I will not let this touch my kids. So that was a wake up call for me to be like, I don't even care what's fair and what's not fair. I have to start this because I don't want my kids to be the cycle breakers.
two things on that I'm going to say. One, I had that same realization one day when things in my life were feeling out of control, chaotic, because I did feel that responsibility to control things. And if it wasn't happening the way I wanted it, I was trying to make it look like it was the way I wanted it. So
Yeah.
there was this perfectionism, hiding behind masks. And all of that is so exhausting. And I was in this really hard place, and my kids, of course, were experiencing a lot of emotions about what was happening. And my son was probably about 11 at the time. And he was upset. And one of the things is when people are upset, it makes me very, very uncomfortable. I cannot handle the dysregulation because for me, that meant
Mm,
disconnection. You're not loved. You're being rejected, emotional abandonment. And
mhm,
so instead of being able to sit in that and
mhm.
offer my child regulation, I needed to control the situation and get him to be regulated so that I was regulated. And so I
Yeah.
looked at him and I just said, if you don't stop crying, I'm going to take your phone away. So it was
Mm,
like, get in line. You're
mhm.
making me uncomfortable. And if you
Yep.
don't stop, I'm going to punish you. And
Mhm.
I was like so broken at the moment the words came out of my mouth and I had this awareness.
Yeah.
What I want to say is, in the past, I would shame myself. I couldn't actually acknowledge that I was doing that to my child,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
God was with me in that moment and allowed me to see it, and then allowed me to not go into a shame spiral, but to actually begin to confront it. And that really started this new journey. And that night I was just so broken and I was like, I can't do this anymore, God. And
Mm,
and he answered me and said, I need you to take your thoughts captive. And I was like, really? This is the advice? I need something miraculous. But it was that awareness of what was going on inside of my head because it was so chaotic and so loud and so
mm,
overwhelming that I needed to be able to sit and sort through it with God, and he was giving me the tools. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is just some of the tools to help us, because if we don't support ourself with compassion and sitting with our little self and acknowledging those hard things, we'll never be able to move past it. And then the second thing that really stood out there is when God showed me trying to control others was actually abuse. And I was in a abusive marriage, and because his expression was more easily to say, oh, that's unhealthy, that's abusive, but I wasn't looking at my role in the equation. You said it takes two to tango. And because I was going behind the scenes, trying to be the fixer, manipulating it, trying to get him to do what I wanted to get my desired outcome, God said abuse is just taking away someone's free will, and that he's not an abusive God because he gives us our free will and we're supposed to be like him. And I was just like, whoa, that blew my mind, because I was like, well, that's not who I want to be.
Yeah.
So how am I going to do this different? How am I going to do the work so that I can be a healthy person in my parenting, in my marriage, in my relationship with people that I work with? How do you lead? And all of those things really are tied in to what we learned as a child and how to interact with those around us.
Megan, every time I talk to you, I'm just so amazed. I'm just so amazed with your humility,
Mm,
and to accept and a sense of accountability. Like, I love that, because you were kind of saying clearly if people took a picture of what you went through, it would be clear, abusive situation. And people tend to make it black and white. So there's like a aggressor and then there's a victim, right? But what you're able to share is that, wow, victim has a role too. And I think kind of going to the tools is, I think the first thing that you already shared is, regardless of the context and situations, like, sure, everybody will look at the situation and say, this is not fair for Megan, regardless of the context, I want to be better. And I think that's the first step. I
mm,
think, like when I was in the beginning of the healing journey, I'm sure many in the audience saw videos of like, are you living with a narcissist or are you parentified? And usually the secular psychology, the context is, and the goal is clarity because they're defining symptoms of narcissism or symptoms of parentified childhood.
mhm,
But when I was looking at those playlists, YouTube playlists, and just like saying, yeah, I was parentified. Yeah, that was not fair. It left me more angry than resolved. And I was doing that for weeks, when I was doing this healing journey. While I felt validated and seen and felt, at the end, I was like, I feel more angry. And
right.
that was the point for me to be like, God, I don't want to be this angry.
Mm,
I don't want to be this angry, like for me. And I have to choose something else. And that's when, psychology has a role, but that's when I was like, I need healing. And
mm,
healing is different because healing brings you back into full circle moments where you're entering the old space with a new heart.
oh,
And
so good.
that's what you're able to do when you're healed. And I had to choose that path because it is an uphill road.
Mm,
You might feel less seen and less validated because you're not tooting your angry, narrative all the time. But now I have the power to not say things. Like, I don't have to say my story. There was a moment where when we were re-engaging and reconciling with my family members, after my period of healing, I was sitting in the family therapy, and that morning I was like, God, what do you want me to say? And he said, you don't have to say anything if you don't want to. And this unique family therapy session was very unique because they go one person by one person, so nobody's like hogging the space. So it
mhm,
was timed, and I knew that the therapist would ask me like, hey, what do you have to say anything to that, And I said no. And I had a sticky note on my computer during that family therapy session that the Lord knows who are his, and God knows that I'm his, and I know that I'm God's, and I don't need anyone else to see it or validate it. Like, it's already validated.
so
So when
good.
you're healed, that there's that freedom from that mental voice space. Like there's
Mm.
no need to prove, there's no need to share the evidence why you're hurt or why this is not fair, because it's already packaged up nicely. And you can share it if you want to, and you don't have to share it if you don't want to.
Well, it sounds like we're talking about standing in our true identity, which
Hmm.
is in God. And we're going to talk more as we go into our next part and talk about the healing journey and how to find reconciliation, peace, and purpose. And I do believe, like you said, psychology is a tool and it gives us maybe words to understand, but psychology without God is fallible. And I'm so excited to continue this conversation because I was just writing a chapter about this in my next book, Unlocked, about how when the promise, so we've been given promises in the Bible, and identity is one of those promises, but we will meet resistance to
Mm,
those promises. And how do we navigate when that resistance comes up so that we can sit with the dysregulation, the discomfort, and allow the Holy Spirit to give us insight and wisdom, because He knows us. He knows our purpose. He knows our family members. He knows their stories. And He really will give us direction when we invite Him into that process. So I'm really excited to talk about that in part 2. Thanks so much for being here
yeah.
with me.
Thank you.